They were not supposed to get out. There is a specific kind of community fear that a prison escape produces. It is different from any other kind of fear law enforcement manages. It is not the fear of a crime happening somewhere. It is the fear of a person who should not be free, who is somewhere, and who nobody can immediately locate. Schools close. Residents lock their doors. Parents pull their children from activities. The entire perimeter of ordinary daily life contracts around the possibility that the person who escaped is very close and capable of doing again whatever they did before they went in. Today's 4 cases are about that fear, 4 different kinds of escape, 4 different manhunts, and 4 different ways that law enforcement eventually answer the question of where they went. The 4 situations today are as different as the people involved. A convicted murderer in Pennsylvania who escaped from his prison the same way another inmate had used 2 months earlier, and who used 14 days of woodland, stolen vehicles, a stolen rifle, and a change appearance to stay ahead of 500 officers in a national news cycle before a Border Patrol dog bit him in the underbrush. An Alabama corrections officer with 17 years on the job who spent months in a romantic relationship with an inmate awaiting trial for capital murder, then walked him out of the jail herself on the morning of April 29, 2022, and did not come back. 10 inmates in New Orleans who used Scrabble tiles to jam a cell door lock, squeezed through a hole behind a toilet, wrote graffiti at the escape site that said easy LOL with an arrow pointing at a wall, and spent months evading one of the largest multi-agency manhunts in Louisiana history. And a former small-town police chief in Arkansas convicted of murder and rape, profiled in a national crime documentary as a devil in the Ozarks who spent months planning his escape from inside a prison kitchen, put on a corrections officer uniform, pulled a food cart through a sally port while a guard opened the gate, and walked away. All 4 cases are fully verified. 3 are fully resolved. Every one of the escapees was eventually recaptured. The question today's episode examines is not whether they got caught. They all did. But what the gap was that made each escape possible in the first place, and how difficult it was for hundreds of law enforcement officers to close it once it opened. Before the first case, pay attention to one specific element across all 4 escapes, what each person understood about the system they were trying to beat. Every escape today involved a specific, exploitable gap, something known about the facility, the staff, the technology, or the routine. Track that gap in each case, and tell me in the comments which one you think was the hardest to close after it was exposed. He watched someone else do it first. Chester County, Pennsylvania, August 31st, 2023. Recaptured September 13th, 2023. Thursday morning, August 31st, 2023. 8:51 a.m. The exercise yard of Chester County Prison in Pocopson Township, Chester County, Pennsylvania. A facility set in a heavily wooded rural area about 30 miles west of Philadelphia. Danilo Cavalcante, 34 years old, a Brazilian national, has been a resident of Chester County Prison for several weeks. He was convicted of first-degree murder 16 days ago, August 16th, for fatally stabbing his former girlfriend, 33-year-old Deborah Brandow, in April 2021 in front of her 2 young children. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He is also wanted in Brazil in connection with a 2017 homicide there. He was a week away from being transferred to a state correctional institution to begin serving that life sentence. The surveillance footage of what happens next in the Chester County Prison exercise yard was released publicly 1 week after the escape, and immediately became one of the most widely viewed prison security videos in recent American history. Cavalcante stands in the yard, 5 feet tall, 120 pounds. He looks around him, the posture of someone checking whether anyone is watching. Then he places his hands against a brick wall and walks his feet up the surface of an adjacent fence, arms on one surface and legs on another, moving perpendicularly in a motion that became universally described as crab walk. Within 7 seconds he has cleared the roof line. He pushes through the razor wire. He crosses the roof. He scales another fence. He pushes through more razor wire. He is gone from the camera's frame. The guard in the watchtower, an 18-year veteran of the Chester County Prison, had a cell phone out at the time of the escape, a violation of prison policy. He did not see Cavalcante leave. It took the prison more than 50 minutes to notice he was missing during a head count. By that point, Danilo Cavalcante had been outside for nearly an hour. The method he copied. The specific reason Cavalcante knew this method would work is that he had watched someone else do it. On May 19, 2023, more than 3 months before Cavalcante's escape, an inmate named Igor Bolt had escaped from the Chester County Prison's exercise yard using the same crab walk technique, scaling the same wall. Bolt was recaptured within minutes because a guard in the watchtower saw him and reported it. Cavalcante knew from Bolt's attempt that the method itself worked. He also knew or observed that the tower guard coverage could have gaps. The acting warden of Chester County Prison, Howard Holland, confirmed at a news conference that Cavalcante used the same escape route Bolt had used in May. Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro later said publicly, "I think there are questions that Chester County officials are going to have to answer as to how this suspect was able to escape, particularly given the history at that jail." The tower guard was placed on administrative leave and was eventually fired. The cell phone he had in the tower, which the prison's own policy prohibited, was a reason he missed the only window he had to stop Cavalcante on the roof. 14 days in the woods. The manhunt that followed was one of the largest in Pennsylvania history. At its peak, approximately 500 law enforcement officers deployed to a search area spanning roughly 3 miles across Chester County. 2 local school districts canceled classes. Longwood Garden Botanical Park closed after trail cameras spotted Cavalcante there on 2 separate occasions. Over 14 days, he was cited 7 confirmed times. He adapted continuously, shaved his facial hair, changed clothing, stole a van from a dairy farm, showed up at former work colleagues' homes. On the night of September 11th, he broke into a homeowner's garage and stole a .22 caliber rifle. The homeowner fired several shots at him and missed. Cavalcante was now armed. Law enforcement's concern level escalated immediately. How it ended. Shortly after midnight on September 13th, a burglar alarm triggered at a home inside the search perimeter. Officers responded but did not find Cavalcante. At approximately 1 a.m., a fixed-wing aircraft equipped with thermal imaging technology picked up a heat signal on the ground. A lightning storm developed and forced the aircraft to depart temporarily. Customs and Border Protection tactical teams and Pennsylvania State Police units held the perimeter through the storm. Shortly after 8 a.m., the tactical teams converged on the location of the heat signal. Cavalcante did not realize he was surrounded until officers were already on top of him. He attempted to crawl through thick underbrush, still carrying the stolen rifle. A Customs and Border Protection tactical dog reached him, bit him, and pinned him. He was taken into custody with a minor scalp wound and no other injuries to anyone. He was wearing a Philadelphia Eagles sweatshirt and was wrapped in a foil blanket as he was escorted by more than a dozen heavily armed officers to a waiting vehicle. Chester County District Attorney Deb Ryan declared at the morning press conference, "Our nightmare is finally over and the good guys won." Pennsylvania State Police Lieutenant Colonel George Bivens said Cavalcante had been defiant and was still resisting when the dog reached him, and that the rifle was within arm's reach when he was taken down. The tower guard, who had been on the phone instead of watching the yard, had been fired by the time the manhunt ended. The Chester County Prison began installing security modifications to prevent the same crab-walking technique from being used again. The Pennsylvania Attorney General's office opened an investigation into the escape. Cavalcante was transferred to SCI Phoenix, a maximum security state prison in Montgomery County, to begin serving his life sentence. He would not be crab-walking out of that facility. Cavalcante watched another inmate use the same technique 3 months before his own escape. That inmate was caught immediately because a guard saw him. Cavalcante succeeded because a different guard was on a cell phone in the tower instead of watching the yard. 2 gaps, the unaddressed wall vulnerability and the prohibited phone, combined on a Thursday morning to produce a 14-day manhunt involving 500 officers. At what point should a prison have been required to address the wall vulnerability after the first escape in May? And what should the professional consequences be for an institution that does not close a known escape route before a second person uses it? Tell me in the comments. August 31st, 2023, 8:51 a.m. A crab walk across a prison wall that another inmate had used 3 months earlier. A guard on his phone in the tower who never saw it happen. 14 days. 500 officers. 2 school districts shut down. A botanical garden closed. A stolen van. A stolen rifle, a homeowner who fired shots at him in a garage and missed, a heat signal at 1 in the morning, a lightning storm, a Border Patrol dog in the underbrush, a Philadelphia Eagles sweatshirt, a foil blanket. Our nightmare is finally over. Cavalcante is at a maximum security state prison. The tower guard is fired. The wall vulnerability was known since May. The guard had a phone. That is the entire chain of events that produced 14 days of fear. She walked him out the front door. Lauderdale County, Alabama, April 29, 2022. Casey White sentenced to life, June 2022. Friday morning, April 29, 2022. The Lauderdale County Detention Center in Florence, Alabama. Vicky White, 56 years old, has been an assistant director of corrections at this facility for 17 years. She is known to colleagues as someone who genuinely cares about her job. She is 1 month away from retirement. She has already sold her house, cashed out her pension, and bought a car in a different name. At 9:30 in the morning, the jail surveillance cameras capture her walking through the facility with Casey Cole White, 38 years old, an inmate who has been in the Lauderdale County Detention Center awaiting trial on a capital murder charge in the death of a woman named Connie Ridgway. Vicky White tells her supervisors she is transporting Casey White for a mental health evaluation at a courthouse in Tuscaloosa. The appointment does not exist. She has fabricated it. The surveillance video shows them walking out together. A marked corrections vehicle is found later in a parking lot in Florence. They are gone. They are not related. The coincidence of the shared last name became one of the most frequently noted details in the coverage that followed. What had actually been happening between Vicky White and Casey White was something colleagues said they never saw coming, and that investigators, reviewing the record, determined had been developing for months. Vicky White had formed what detectives described as a romantic attachment to Casey White during his time at the Lauderdale County Jail. She had been making purchases and moving money for months. She had sold her house in January at a loss of about $35,000. She had cashed out her retirement account. She had paid cash for a vehicle in a different name. When she walked Casey White out the front door, she had burned every material exit from her previous life behind her. 10 days on the run. The U.S. Marshals Service coordinated the manhunt. The case received enormous national attention. Investigators worked through ATM card records, burner phone traces, and cash transactions. They determined Vicky White had purchased a Ford F-150 pickup truck in a false name. 10 days after the escape, on May 9, 2022, law enforcement located the pair at an extended stay America motel in Evansville, Indiana, roughly 400 miles north of Florence. U.S. Marshals and Evansville police surrounded the vehicle as the pair were in the parking lot. Casey White refused to exit. The pickup accelerated and was rammed by law enforcement vehicles. Vicky White sustained a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. She died the following day. Casey White was taken into custody. He had a loaded handgun. He was extradited back to Alabama. The sentence and the aftermath. Casey Cole White pleaded guilty in May 2023 to escape in the first degree, in exchange for dropping one of the underlying murder charges. He had already received a life sentence for his prior violent crime spree. The capital murder charge for the death of Connie Ridgway was suspended in July 2023. Prosecutors said he was already serving what amounted to a life sentence and there was no need to pursue it further. Her family said there is always a need. Casey White will not be eligible for parole until 2081, when he will be 98 years old. Vicky White died in a motel parking lot in Indiana. New policies at the Lauderdale County Jail now require independent verification of court appointments before transport and prohibit solo transport of high-security inmates. Those policies were implemented after the escape. They did not exist before it. Vicky White spent months planning this. She sold her house at a loss, cashed out her retirement account, bought a vehicle in a false name, fabricated a court appointment, and walked a capital murder suspect out through a door she had been authorized to use for 17 years. She was a month from retirement. The oversight systems at the Lauderdale County Jail did not flag any of her preparatory steps. The appointment she invented was never verified before the transport began. New policies implemented after the escape require independent verification of court dates and prohibit solo transport of high-security inmates. Those policies existed after the escape. They did not exist before it. What would it take for a correctional facility to proactively identify when a staff member is in an inappropriate relationship with an inmate before the consequences are this severe? Tell me in the comments. April 29, 2022. A fabricated mental health appointment. 17 years of institutional access used on the morning of the escape. A house sold at a loss. A pension cashed out. A vehicle bought in a false name. Two people walking out of a jail together in the surveillance footage. 10 days. Indiana. A motel parking lot. A ram from a law enforcement vehicle. A self-inflicted gunshot wound. A death. An extradition. A life sentence to 2081. The policy changes that were implemented after the escape were not in place before it. Casey White is 98 years old in 2081. Vicky White loved him. She had 17 years of access to that building. She used all of them on one morning. To easy LOL. New Orleans, Louisiana, May 16th, 2025, all 10 recaptured. Final capture October 8th, 2025. Friday morning, May 16th, 2025. The Orleans Parish Jail in New Orleans, Louisiana. A lone corrections officer takes a meal break. In the section of the facility where 10 inmates are housed, those inmates have been using Scrabble tiles and other small objects available to them to jam their cell door locks, a method that had been documented in pre-escape inspection reports but not addressed. The jammed locks allow the cell doors to appear closed while being openable from the inside. While the officer is on break, the 10 inmates move. They pry open a faulty cell door. They squeeze through a hole that has been made behind a toilet in the wall of the facility. They climb a barbed wire fence. They are in the streets of New Orleans. When morning head count reveals they are gone, staff find graffiti at the scene of the breach. It says, "To easy LOL," with an arrow pointing at the hole in the wall. The 10 men who wrote it included people charged with murder, kidnapping, rape, and armed robbery. They are now in the city. The Orleans Parish Jail had been under scrutiny before the escape. An independent monitoring report, written in the weeks before the breakout, had specifically warned Sheriff Susan Hudson to re-establish a high-security housing unit, a measure Hudson had discontinued in 2022. The same report noted that many inmate-on-inmate assaults had occurred due to unsupervised movement or manipulated locks. That report was written before the 10 men squeezed through the hole. The faulty cell door that became the initial breach point was a documented maintenance issue. The Scrabble tiles used to jam the locks are a documented problem in correctional facilities. 3 things were already known before May 16th. None of them had been fixed. The manhunt across multiple states. The U.S. Marshal Service, Louisiana State Police, and the Orleans Parish Sheriff's Office coordinated the manhunt. 3 of the 10 escapees were recaptured in New Orleans on the same day they escaped. The remaining 7 were the subject of a multi-agency search that extended across state lines. By the end of May, 8 of the 10 had been taken into custody. 2 New Orleans escapees were recaptured in Texas after a vehicle pursuit that was captured on body camera. Surveillance footage showed them in a car driving on the wrong side of the road and weaving through traffic before abruptly stopping. 9 of the 10 were in custody by late June. The final escapee, Derek Groves, was 27 years old, convicted in 2023 of 2 counts of second-degree murder and 2 counts of attempted second-degree murder for his role in a 2018 Mardi Gras Day shooting. He was also facing a charge of battery against a correctional officer. Of the 10 people who went through that wall, he was the one who ran longest and farthest. Groves evaded law enforcement for nearly 5 months. A $20,000 reward was offered for information leading to his arrest. Louisiana State Police Superintendent Robert Hodges announced in early October 2025 that the task force had determined, through search warrants and other investigative means, that Groves was likely in the Atlanta area. He was traced to a specific residence in southwest Atlanta. Police, U.S. Marshals, and a SWAT team arrived at the house. They took Groves into custody after what was described as a brief standoff. He was found hiding beneath the house. He was the 10th and final escapee to be recaptured. On October 8, 2025, 145 days after he squeezed through the hole behind a toilet and wrote a joke on the wall. What came after? The investigation into the escape produced more than a dozen arrests of people who had allegedly assisted the escapees. Among those arrested was Dariana Burton, a former Orleans Parish Sheriff's Office employee fired in March 2023 for bringing contraband into the jail, and Groves' on-again, off-again girlfriend of 3 years. A police affidavit alleged Groves had video-called Burton on a jail-issued iPad 2 days before the escape, and that their conversation appeared to coordinate communication on unmonitored lines. Her bond was set at $2.5 million. Louisiana Attorney General Liz Murrill said of Groves after his capture, "He's got a lot of trouble and a lot of things to answer to both the state of Louisiana and the state of Georgia." She noted that the manhunt had been frightening for district attorney staff, victims, and witnesses in the cases that had put him behind bars. The "To Easy LOL" graffiti at the escape site became the caption for every question that followed about who bore responsibility for conditions that made it true. A monitoring report written before the escape identified manipulated locks and unsupervised movement as documented problems. The faulty cell door was a known maintenance issue. A lone officer took a meal break. 10 people walked out through a hole behind a toilet and wrote a joke on the wall. 3 were caught the same day. The last one was found hiding under a house in Atlanta 5 months later. More than a dozen people who helped the escapees were arrested. The sheriff had discontinued the high-security housing unit the monitoring report recommended restoring. When a monitoring report documents the exact conditions that will produce an escape, and those conditions are not remediated, and the escape happens, where does institutional responsibility begin and end? Tell me in the comments. May 16th, 2025. New Orleans. A meal break. Scrabble tiles. A faulty cell door. A hole behind a toilet. A barbed wire fence. 10 men. To Easy LOL. An arrow pointing at the breach. 3 caught the same day. 7 more over the next weeks. 2 caught in Texas on body camera after pursuit on the wrong side of the road. 9 in custody by June. Derek Rose. 5 months. A $20,000 reward. A trace to Southwest Atlanta. Found hiding under a house. A brief standoff. Custody on October 8, 2025. The monitoring report that documented manipulated locks and unsupervised movement before the escape was written before the escape. The jail discontinued a high-security housing unit in 2022. The graffiti on the wall said easy. They were right about that. He planned it in the kitchen. Calico Rock, Arkansas, May 25, 2025. Recaptured June 6, 2025. Sunday, May 25, 2025. The Calico Rock North Central Unit in Izard County, Arkansas, a state prison facility set in the rugged Ozark Mountains of northern Arkansas, a region of steep hollows, dense forests, and river valleys that was already nationally known in a very specific way, in connection with a man who would escape from it that day. Grant Hardin, 56 years old, is serving a sentence that reflects the 2 categories of crime for which he was convicted: 30 years for the first-degree murder of 59-year-old James Appleton in a 2017 shooting, and a separate conviction for the 1997 rape of an elementary school teacher in Rogers, Arkansas. He is, in the Arkansas criminal justice system and in the national public consciousness, the man known as the Devil in the Ozarks, the former police chief of Gateway, Arkansas, a town of about 450 people, who had used his badge, his community standing, and his authority for crimes that a 2023 Netflix documentary spent considerable time examining. He is also, on May 25, 2025, an employee of the prison kitchen. Hardin had, according to the Arkansas Department of Corrections, spent months planning what happened on May 25th. He had been assigned to work in the prison kitchen as part of his institutional duties. Overtime, he had identified a specific gap in how the kitchen area interfaced with the security systems of the facility, specifically how the sallyport process that governed movement of food carts between the kitchen and other parts of the prison was operated. The sallyport is a controlled entry and exit point, a gated airlock-style passage designed to prevent unauthorized movement. It opens when authorized by a corrections officer who verifies the person or people requesting passage. Hardin obtained or assembled a corrections officer uniform. On the morning of May 25th, wearing that uniform, he loaded a food cart and approached the sallyport. A corrections officer opened the gate. Hardin walked through it and away from the facility. The Devil in the Ozarks is out. The Arkansas Department of Corrections confirmed the escape on May 25th and issued an immediate public alert. Governor Sarah Huckabee Sanders directed state law enforcement to respond with full resources. The FBI and U.S. Marshals Service offered a combined $25,000 reward for information leading to Hardin's capture. Law enforcement deployed helicopters, drones, K-9 units, and ground search teams into the Izard County terrain, which is among the most difficult in Arkansas' rugged hills, dense hardwood forests, river bottomlands, and the Buffalo National River corridor nearby. Stone County Sheriff Brandon Long spoke to reporters on the day of the escape and made a statement that communicated the specific urgency that this particular fugitive created. "I'm very scared that this guy is going to hurt or kill somebody before this is over with. He is convicted of murder. He is convicted of rape. He was a police chief. He planned his way out of a state prison. He is somewhere in the Ozarks. The Arkansas Department of Corrections began an immediate investigation into how Hardin had obtained the uniform and how the Sallyport process had failed to detect that the person pulling the food cart was an inmate rather than an officer. Following the recapture, the department disciplined multiple corrections employees and concluded that the escape was a result of staff failure, individual human errors in the verification process, rather than a systemic breakdown in departmental policy. That distinction between individual failure and policy failure is a kind of conclusion that matters for institutional accountability questions, but does not change the fact that a convicted murderer and rapist had spent months preparing an impersonation of a corrections officer that was good enough to get through a Sallyport on a Sunday morning. Found 13 days later, 1 mile from the prison. The manhunt ran for 13 days. On June 6, 2025, approximately 1.5 miles west of the North Central Unit, Grant Hardin was located and taken into custody. His identity was confirmed by fingerprint analysis. A U.S. Border Patrol Tactical Unit BORTAC, deployed from Texas, was credited as instrumental in tracking him down. Hardin had spent 13 days in the immediate vicinity of the prison. The rugged terrain that law enforcement found so difficult to search apparently also limited his ability to travel far or fast. Prosecutor Brian Sexton described the notification calls he had made to victims' families when the escape was announced. Making those contact again with folks who have moved on with their lives for the better part of a decade now, and to have to be the one who picks up the phone and reminds them of what has happened to them, is something that weighs heavily on me. For 13 days, the families of James Appleton and of the elementary school teacher Hardin raped in 1997 knew he was somewhere in the Ozarks. The corrections employees whose individual failures allowed a man in a kitchen to accumulate a uniform and walk through a gate were identified, disciplined, and processed by the department. Grant Hardin is back in custody. The Sallyport is presumably more carefully operated than it was on the morning of May 25, 2025. Grant Hardin is a convicted murderer and rapist who was a police chief before he was convicted. He was profiled in a national crime documentary. He spent months in a prison kitchen planning an impersonation of a corrections officer detailed enough to get him through a Sallyport. He was found 1.5 miles from the prison 13 days later. Multiple corrections employees were disciplined. The department concluded it was staff failure rather than policy failure. The families of his victims had to be called and told he was out. For 13 days they knew he was somewhere in the Ozarks. He had been a police chief. He had planned it in the kitchen. What should the policy implications be when a convicted violent offender uses a work assignment to plan an escape over months, and when the escape is ultimately attributed to individual staff failures? Does that conclusion fully address what the planning required and what the oversight missed? Tell me in the comments. May 25th, 2025. The North Central Unit, Izard County, Arkansas. A kitchen assignment. A uniform obtained over months. A food cart. A Sallyport. A corrections officer who opened the gate. Grant Hardin, the former police chief, the convicted murderer, the convicted rapist, the devil in the Ozarks, walking away from a state prison on a Sunday morning in a corrections officer uniform. 13 days. Helicopters, drones, K-9 units, $25,000 in reward money. BORTAC deployed from Texas. Brandon Long on camera. I'm very scared this guy is going to hurt or kill somebody before this is over with. Found 1.5 miles west of the prison on June 6. Fingerprints confirmed. Multiple employees disciplined. Staff failure, the department said. Not policy failure. The families of his victims were called when he got out. They had to be called again when he was found. They all got caught. 4 escapes. 4 different methods. 4 different manhunts across multiple states. And 4 recaptures, every one of them eventually back in custody. Cavalcante, 14 days in Pennsylvania woods, 500 officers, a stolen rifle, and a Border Patrol dog. Vicky and Casey White, 10 days, a false name on a vehicle registration, and a motel parking lot in Indiana. The New Orleans 10, 3 caught the same day, the rest over weeks and months, the last found hiding under a house in Atlanta in October. Hardin, 13 days, 1.5 miles from the prison. Found by fingerprint. The gap that made each escape possible was different in every case. Chester County, a known wall vulnerability not closed after the first person used it, combined with prohibited phone in a guard tower. Lauderdale County. A romantic relationship developed over months inside a facility, undetected until a fabricated court appointment produced an empty corrections vehicle in a parking lot. New Orleans. Documented conditions, manipulated locks, unsupervised movement, a faulty door, a lone officer on a meal break, combined with the absence of a high-security unit the facility's own monitors had recommended. Arkansas. Months of kitchen assignment access used to assemble corrections officer impersonation specific enough to pass a Sally Port. In every case, the gap was visible in retrospect. In the New Orleans case, it was visible in writing before the escape happened. The Chester County wall should have been modified after the first escape in May. The Lauderdale County transport policy should have required verified court appointments. The Orleans Parish Jail should have addressed its documented lock problem. The North Central Unit should have had controls preventing an inmate from accumulating a uniform over months. They were all caught. Tell me in the comments which of today's 4 manhunts you think law enforcement handled best, and which gap you think was the most preventable. See you in the next one.